They laughed because they thought they knew exactly who she was. But within a single morning, that quiet woman would do what an entire room full of executives could not. Before we continue, where are you watching from? Drop your city or state in the comments below. And if you believe respect should never be based on appearances, be sure to like and subscribe. Stories like this remind us that dignity matters. Now, back to Claire Bennett. Every morning at precisely 7:15 a.m., Claire Bennett stepped through the revolving glass doors of Titan Global Solutions carrying the same worn leather planner and the same calm expression. At 38 years old, she blended into the background so completely that most employees barely noticed her. The towering corporate headquarters rose 50 stories above downtown Chicago, its reflective windows catching the early sunlight while executives in tailored suits hurried through the marble lobby. Claire moved quietly among them, greeting security guards by name and riding the elevator to the executive floor. Her title was simple, Executive Secretary. To most people in the company, that title explained everything they thought they needed to know. She scheduled meetings, organized calendars, prepared conference rooms, and made sure important documents reached the right people on time. While executives discussed billion-dollar contracts behind closed doors, Claire sat outside their offices answering phones and managing schedules. At least, that was what everyone assumed she did. In the executive wing, conversations often stopped when Claire entered the room, not out of respect, but because few considered her important enough to include. Some barely looked up from their laptops when she delivered reports. Others handed her tasks without a thank you. Over the years, she had become almost invisible. Yet Claire never complained. She simply smiled politely and continued her work. On this particular Tuesday morning, the atmosphere felt different. Tension hung in the air like a gathering storm. Employees rushed through hallways with worried expressions. Phones rang more frequently than usual. Several senior managers arrived nearly an hour earlier than normal. Claire noticed everything. She always did. As she arranged documents inside the executive boardroom, voices echoed from the hallway outside. The company's chief operating officer, Ethan Crawford, strode toward the room surrounded by department heads. Tall, confident, and known throughout the organization for his sharp tongue, Ethan carried himself like a man who believed he had all the answers. "Today better not become another disaster," he said as the group entered. Nervous laughter followed. Claire quietly placed a stack of reports at each seat. Ethan glanced at her briefly before turning back to his team. His attention lasted less than a second. To him, she was simply part of the furniture. As executives settled around the massive walnut conference table, floor-to-ceiling windows revealed the Chicago skyline beyond. Screens illuminated the walls. Coffee cups steamed beside laptops. The room looked powerful, successful, untouchable. But appearances can be deceiving. Because while the people in that room believed they were preparing for another routine corporate meeting, events were already moving that would challenge everything they thought they knew. And among all the highly paid experts, analysts, and executives gathered there that morning, the person who understood the most was the one nobody was paying attention to. Claire Bennett took her seat quietly near the back wall, opened her planner, and listened. The room had no idea what was coming. The meeting began at exactly 8 o'clock. 22 executives filled the boardroom, their laptops glowing beneath the soft blue light of the wall-sized displays. Claire sat quietly near the back, taking notes as she always did. Nobody acknowledged her presence. Nobody asked for her opinion. That was normal. For nearly 4 years, Claire Bennett had worked on the executive floor, and during that time, she had mastered the art of becoming invisible. While other employees fought for recognition, she focused on listening. She knew which vice president was secretly looking for another job. She knew which regional director exaggerated quarterly projections. She knew which department consistently missed deadlines despite claiming success. Most importantly, she knew how the company actually operated beneath the polished presentations and carefully rehearsed speeches. Ethan Crawford stood at the front of the room reviewing performance charts. His confident voice carried easily across the boardroom. Numbers appeared on the screens behind him. Revenue growth, expansion forecasts, international partnerships. Everything looked impressive. Investors would have been pleased. Yet Claire noticed something unusual. Several executives kept checking their phones. The chief information officer looked increasingly uncomfortable. The head of global logistics had not spoken once. Tension continued building beneath the surface. Then a sharp notification sound interrupted the presentation. Every head turned. The chief information officer stared at his screen. The color drained from his face. A second notification followed. Then a third. Within seconds, phones across the room began vibrating simultaneously. The atmosphere changed instantly. Ethan stopped speaking mid-sentence. The room grew quiet. Very quiet. The kind of silence that appears when people sense trouble before they understand its size. The chief information officer cleared his throat. We may have a serious problem. Several executives exchanged nervous glances. Another alert appeared on the main display. Then another. Red warning messages spread across the screens one after another. International shipment tracking had stopped updating. Distribution centers were losing connectivity. Customer orders were freezing inside the processing system. A vice president stood abruptly from his chair. How many regions are affected? He asked. Nobody answered immediately. The information arriving was incomplete. Every passing second seemed to reveal something worse. Within minutes, reports arrived from Europe, Asia, and South America. Entire logistics networks were becoming inaccessible. Thousands of shipments could no longer be tracked. Customer support centers were overwhelmed. The boardroom that had seemed calm and powerful only moments earlier now felt completely different. Executives spoke over one another. Analysts rushed in carrying printed reports. Additional screens displayed growing lists of system failures. Through it all, Claire remained silent. She watched the information carefully. She noticed patterns others seemed too distracted to see. Certain regions failed before others. Specific databases stopped responding first. Small details began connecting inside her mind. Meanwhile, the panic continued growing. One executive estimated potential losses approaching several $100 million if operations were not restored quickly. Another warned that major clients were already demanding explanations. Ethan Crawford attempted to regain control of the room, but even he appeared shaken. Outside the glass walls, employees hurried through hallways carrying laptops and phones. Inside, the pressure continued rising. Titan Global Solutions was facing the largest operational crisis in company history. And while everyone searched desperately for answers, the one person quietly noticing what others missed sat alone near the back wall, her planner open, her eyes steady, and her attention fixed on a detail nobody else had recognized. The crisis expanded by the minute. What had started as a system disruption was quickly becoming something far worse. New alerts appeared across the giant displays lining the boardroom walls. Distribution hubs in Germany were offline. Inventory synchronization in Singapore had stopped completely. Major retail partners across North America were reporting missing shipment data. Every update seemed more alarming than the last. The executives who usually projected confidence now looked increasingly uneasy. Several had loosened their ties. Others paced near the windows while speaking urgently into their phones. The polished image of control that Titan Global Solutions had spent decades building was beginning to crack. Ethan Crawford stood at the center of the room, trying to coordinate responses from multiple departments at once. I need solutions, he said sharply. Not explanations. Solutions. Yet nobody seemed to have one. The engineering teams were already investigating. Cybersecurity specialists were reviewing logs. Outside consultants had been contacted. Despite all of that effort, the situation continued deteriorating. Then Claire noticed something. A small detail hidden among hundreds of lines of status reports scrolling across one of the displays. Her eyes narrowed. She reviewed several timestamps. Then another set. The pattern became clearer. The issue was not spreading randomly. It was moving through a specific sequence, like falling dominoes. She quietly compared the information with notes she had taken earlier during the meeting. The connection seemed obvious now. Strange, she thought. Very strange. Claire hesitated. For years, she had learned to stay in the background. Offering opinions in rooms like this rarely ended well for someone in her position. Still, as she watched another wave of failures appear on the screen, remaining silent became harder. Finally, she raised her hand slightly. At first, nobody noticed. Then one of the managers glanced toward the back of the room. Yes, Claire, he asked distractedly. Several executives turned. Claire spoke carefully. The first failures appear connected to a routing conflict inside the synchronization framework. The sequence suggests the problem may be originating from a single configuration cascade rather than independent system failures. The room became quiet for a moment. Not impressed quiet. Confused quiet. Ethan looked at her, as though he was unsure he had heard correctly. Then he laughed softly. A few others followed. A routing conflict? Ethan repeated. Our global engineering division has been analyzing this for nearly an hour. More smiles appeared around the table. Claire remained calm. I understand. I am only pointing out the pattern. Ethan leaned back in his chair. Claire, with all due respect, this is not a scheduling issue or a calendar problem. Several executives chuckled. One manager shook his head. Another whispered something to a colleague that drew additional laughter. The mood in the room shifted. For the first time since the crisis began, people had found a target for their frustration. Ethan folded his arms. Are you suggesting that our engineers missed something that you spotted while taking meeting notes? More laughter followed. Claire felt dozens of eyes fixed on her. Yet she did not look away. I am suggesting that the sequence does not match a network-wide failure. Ethan smiled. Ladies and gentlemen, it appears our executive secretary has solved a global systems crisis. The room erupted in amusement. Even some of the people who had remained silent earlier joined in. Claire lowered her eyes briefly and closed her planner. She said nothing further. But as the laughter faded and another wave of warning alerts flashed across the screens, one person in the room noticed something unusual. While everyone else seemed eager to dismiss her, Claire Bennett looked completely unshaken, almost as if she already knew something they did not. The laughter eventually faded, but the crisis did not. If anything, the situation became worse. Another executive rushed into the boardroom, carrying a tablet. His face alone was enough to silence the remaining smiles. We just lost visibility on another 3 distribution regions, he announced. The room immediately shifted back into emergency mode. Screens refreshed. New warnings appeared. Customer complaints were increasing by the minute. Several major partners were now threatening contractual penalties if operations were not restored quickly. Ethan Crawford's confidence began to erode beneath the mounting pressure. He turned toward the engineering leads. Tell me we have progress. Nobody answered immediately. One engineer finally shook his head. We are still tracing the source. Every fix triggers additional failures somewhere else. A heavy silence settled across the room. Outside the glass walls, employees moved rapidly between offices. Inside, millions of dollars were disappearing with every passing minute. Claire remained seated near the back. She reopened her planner and quietly reviewed her notes. Nobody paid attention to her now. The room had already dismissed her. Yet while executives argued over theories, Claire's thoughts drifted somewhere else entirely. Years earlier, she had spent countless nights inside server facilities much larger than this company's entire technology division. She remembered the hum of cooling systems, the endless streams of diagnostic data, the pressure of making decisions when entire organizations depended on a single solution. Those memories felt distant now, almost like another lifetime. Most people at Titan Global Solutions knew nothing about her life before she became a secretary. They never asked, and Claire never volunteered the information. To them, she was simply the woman who scheduled meetings and coordinated travel arrangements. Few would have believed that she once sat at conference tables very much like this one, leading conversations instead of taking notes. Few would have believed that some of the largest technology firms in the country had once competed to hire her. But success had come with sacrifices. After a series of personal losses years ago, Claire had stepped away from a career that consumed every hour of her life. She chose something quieter, something simpler. And over time, people stopped seeing her entirely. A sudden voice pulled her back to the present. We are running out of options, said the chief information officer. The statement hung in the air. Nobody argued. Nobody could. Ethan rubbed his forehead and stared at the growing list of failures. For the first time all morning, uncertainty showed openly on his face. Then Claire noticed another detail on one of the screens. A timestamp, a configuration update, a sequence number. 3 separate pieces of information connected instantly in her mind. The answer became even clearer. She looked up. Across the room, executives continued debating complex scenarios and worst-case projections. Yet none of them appeared focused on the one clue that mattered. Claire slowly closed her planner. Her expression remained calm, steady, almost patient, as though she were watching people search frantically for a door while standing inches away from it. Near the center of the room, one member of the board quietly observed her. Margaret Holloway, The company's senior board representative had noticed something unusual hours earlier. While everyone else grew more anxious with each passing update, Claire seemed remarkably composed. Margaret narrowed her eyes thoughtfully, because experience had taught her something important. The people who panic the least during a crisis are often the people who understand it the most. Margaret Holloway continued watching Claire from across the boardroom. The more she observed, the more curious she became. Everyone else was reacting emotionally to the crisis. Some executives were frustrated. Others were visibly worried. A few appeared close to panic. Yet Claire remained calm. Not careless. Not detached. Calm. There was a difference. Another update arrived. The chief information officer reviewed it and slowly exhaled. We have now lost synchronization across 21 international distribution channels. A wave of silence moved through the room. Even Ethan Crawford had stopped pretending everything was under control. The financial impact estimates were growing larger by the minute. Several major clients had already requested emergency calls with senior leadership. The company was approaching a tipping point. Margaret finally stood from her chair. How much longer before we face complete operational shutdown? She asked. The answer came quickly. Less than 2 hours if this continues. Nobody spoke after that. The boardroom fell silent. Outside the windows, Chicago looked unchanged. Traffic flowed through the streets. Sunlight reflected from neighboring skyscrapers. Yet inside Titan Global Solutions, an entire corporate empire was beginning to wobble. Ethan walked toward the main display and stared at the endless stream of alerts. For the first time all morning, he looked genuinely exhausted. Give me something, he said quietly. Anything. The engineering leads exchanged uncertain glances. No one had a solution. Margaret's eyes moved back toward Claire. Then she made a decision. Claire. The room turned. You mentioned a pattern earlier. Ethan looked immediately annoyed. Margaret, with respect, we do not have time for guesses. She ignored him. Claire, tell me exactly what you saw. Claire hesitated. The attention of the entire room suddenly focused on her. For a brief moment, nobody laughed. Nobody interrupted. She slowly stood. The failures began immediately after a configuration update executed at 3 distribution hubs. Several executives frowned. Claire continued. The sequence spread through dependent synchronization channels afterward. The timing suggests the update itself is not the problem. The validation layer connected to it is. One engineer shook his head. We already reviewed the update package. Claire nodded. I believe the package is functioning correctly. I think the validation process attached to it is creating a recursive conflict. The room became quiet again. This time the silence felt different. Some executives looked skeptical. Others appeared thoughtful. Ethan crossed his arms. And how exactly would you know that? The question carried the same condescension as before. Claire met his gaze. Because the behavior is predictable. Ethan laughed once. Short and dismissive. Predictable to whom? Before Claire could answer, another engineer suddenly looked up from his laptop. His expression changed. Fast. Wait. Fingers moved rapidly across his keyboard. A few seconds later, he pulled up additional diagnostic data. His eyes widened. Hold on. Another engineer moved closer. Then another. They reviewed the information together. Nobody spoke. The room watched. 20 seconds passed. 30. Finally, the first engineer looked toward the boardroom table. The recursive validation loop is real. The words landed like a stone in still water. Several executives straightened in their seats. Ethan's confident expression faltered for the first time all day. The engineer continued. If she is right about the source, we may be able to isolate it. A hush fell across the room. Claire remained standing quietly near the back wall. She had not celebrated. She had not argued. She had only pointed toward the door everyone else had failed to see. And for the first time that morning, nobody in the room was laughing. The atmosphere inside the boardroom changed completely. The laughter was gone. The dismissive smiles had vanished. Now every eye was fixed on the engineering team as they examined the evidence Claire had identified. One engineer pulled additional diagnostic reports onto the main display. Another began tracing system dependencies. A third reviewed archived configuration logs. The giant screens illuminated the room with shifting blue and white light, while dozens of executives waited for answers. Nobody seemed interested in checking their phones anymore. Nobody was whispering. The room had become remarkably quiet. Ethan Crawford remained standing near the conference table. His expression revealed nothing but the tension in his posture was impossible to miss. He watched as the engineers worked through the data. Seconds stretched into minutes. Finally, the lead engineer looked up. The recursive validation loop is triggering every time the synchronization framework attempts to confirm a completed transaction. He paused before continuing. That explains why every attempted fix is creating additional failures. A murmur spread through the room. The realization hit hard. Entire teams had spent hours fighting symptoms instead of the source. Margaret Holloway turned toward Claire. Can it be stopped? The room fell silent again. Claire considered the question carefully. Yes. The answer came without hesitation. Several executives exchanged surprised glances. Ethan narrowed his eyes. You sound very certain. Claire nodded. Because the failure is behaving exactly as the architecture was designed to behave. One engineer frowned. What do you mean? Claire stepped closer to the display. For the first time all day, nobody interrupted her. She pointed toward a series of linked processes on the screen. The validation layer is not malfunctioning. It is protecting the system. It believes corrupted data is entering the network, so it continues triggering defensive verification cycles. The engineers stared at the diagram. Suddenly, one of them sat upright. That would explain everything. Another engineer immediately agreed. If we isolate the validation trigger instead of attacking the synchronization framework, the cascade should stop. The room seemed to hold its breath. Ethan looked from the engineers to Claire and back again. Can we do it? He asked. The lead engineer hesitated. Then he answered honestly. Possibly. But we have never attempted a correction at this scale while the network remains active. Silence followed. The risk was obvious. A failed intervention could make the crisis even worse. Claire remained calm. There is another option. Every face turned toward her. She walked to the display and examined the system map. Her eyes moved confidently across the network architecture, almost as though she had seen it before. The correction can be performed in stages. One engineer blinked. Another slowly leaned forward. The lead engineer's eyes widened. That would prevent the secondary cascades. Claire nodded. Exactly. For several seconds, nobody spoke. Then the engineer looked directly at Margaret. She is right. The words landed with unexpected force. Around the boardroom table, executives who had ignored Claire for years suddenly found themselves listening to every word she said. Even Ethan Crawford had stopped objecting. Outside the windows, the city continued moving beneath the afternoon sun. Inside the boardroom, however, something important had changed. For the first time since the crisis began, the company finally had a path forward. And strangely enough, that path had come from the one person nobody had considered an expert. No one questioned Claire's plan anymore. The crisis had stripped away titles, assumptions, and pride. All that mattered now was whether the company could survive the next few minutes. The engineering team immediately reorganized around the staged correction strategy she had outlined. Laptops covered the conference table. Diagnostic dashboards filled every screen. The lead engineer coordinated commands while specialists across multiple continents joined emergency calls. Yet something unusual was happening. Whenever uncertainty appeared, eyes turned toward Claire. Not because she demanded attention, not because she spoke the loudest, but because every prediction she had made so far had proven correct. Margaret Holloway noticed it. So did everyone else. Claire stepped beside one of the engineers and quietly reviewed the execution sequence. Her voice remained calm. Do not disable the validation layer completely. Redirect it first. If you remove it all at once, the system will interpret the change as another threat. The engineer nodded and adjusted the procedure. Moments later, the first phase began. Across the wall displays, thousands of active processes shifted into temporary holding patterns. The room watched in complete silence. A countdown timer appeared on one screen. 30 seconds. 20 seconds. 10. Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. Then the first result appeared. One of the distribution regions came back online. Several executives leaned forward in their seats. The status indicator changed from red to green. A few seconds later, a second region recovered. Then a third. The lead engineer stared at his monitor. The cascade is slowing. Another specialist confirmed it from a remote office overseas. System pressure is dropping. Claire remained focused. Proceed to phase 2. Fingers moved rapidly across keyboards. Additional commands were executed. More data flowed through the network. The giant displays refreshed again. Green indicators began appearing faster now. Logistics channels restored synchronization. Inventory databases resumed communication. Shipment tracking services restarted one by one. It felt almost unreal. For hours, the crisis had seemed unstoppable. Now the company was watching it unravel in reverse. Ethan Crawford stood motionless near the conference table. The same man who had laughed earlier now looked completely stunned. He followed every update appearing on the screens. Every restored region. Every recovered service. Every confirmation that Claire's solution was working exactly as she said it would. Then came the moment nobody expected. A notification appeared at the top of the main display. Global synchronization restored. For a second, nobody reacted. It was as if the room needed time to process what had happened. Then additional confirmations arrived. Customer systems were reconnecting. Distribution centers were operational. Shipment visibility had returned across all affected regions. The crisis that had threatened the company only hours earlier was effectively over. A hush fell across the boardroom. The only sound was the soft hum of electronics and distant city traffic beyond the glass walls. Several executives looked at the screens, then at Claire, then back at the screens again. The lead engineer slowly removed his glasses and shook his head in disbelief. "I have never seen anything like that," he said quietly. Claire simply closed the laptop in front of her. No celebration, no speech, no attempt to prove a point. She had done what needed to be done. Yet as the room sat in stunned silence, one question was beginning to form in every mind. Who exactly was Claire Bennett? The question lingered in the boardroom long after the crisis ended. Nobody returned to their seats. Nobody resumed the agenda. The emergency that had consumed the entire company only hours earlier had been resolved. Yet the silence that followed felt even more powerful. Across the massive displays, green status indicators continued replacing the final warning messages. International distribution channels were stable. Customer systems were operational. Incoming reports confirmed that major clients had withdrawn their concerns and resumed normal activity. Titan Global Solutions had been pulled back from the edge. And somehow, the person responsible was the same woman many of them had ignored for years. Claire gathered her planner and prepared to leave quietly. That was when Margaret Holloway spoke. "One moment, Claire." Every eye followed her. Claire paused beside the conference table. Margaret opened a folder she had carried into the meeting earlier that morning. Her expression was calm, but there was something almost knowing behind it now. "I think there is something everyone here should understand." Ethan Crawford looked confused. Several executives exchanged curious glances. Margaret removed a document from the folder and placed it on the table. "When I joined this board 7 years ago, I was serving on another technology advisory committee." She looked around the room. At that time, one of the most respected systems architects in the country presented a framework that changed how large-scale logistics networks handled synchronization failures. The lead engineer frowned slightly. The name sounded familiar. Margaret continued. "The design was adopted by numerous corporations, including ours." The room grew quiet. Claire lowered her eyes. She already knew where this conversation was going. Margaret finally looked directly at her. The architect who created that framework was Claire Bennett. For a second, nobody reacted. Then the realization began spreading across the room. The lead engineer's eyes widened first. One executive immediately reached for a laptop. Another searched through archived industry records. Within moments, stunned expressions appeared everywhere. Photographs, conference presentations, technical publications, awards. They all led back to the same person standing quietly beside the boardroom door. Ethan stared at the screen nearest him. He could barely believe what he was seeing. Years before becoming a secretary, Claire had been recognized throughout the technology industry as one of the leading minds in enterprise systems architecture. Her work had influenced platforms used by some of the largest organizations in the world. The same architecture principles that helped save the company today had originated from her own research. A hush fell across the room. Ethan slowly looked up. The confidence that had defined him all morning was gone. In its place was something else. Embarrassment, reflection, understanding. Claire did not appear proud. She did not appear angry either. If anything, she seemed uncomfortable with the attention. Margaret smiled gently. Some people spend so much time looking at titles that they forget to look at people. Nobody disagreed. Around the table, executives who had once dismissed Claire now saw her differently. Not because she had demanded respect. Not because she had revealed her accomplishments. But because her actions had made the truth impossible to ignore, and standing there beneath the glow of the conference screens, Claire Bennett reminded everyone in that room of something they should have known from the beginning. The most valuable person is not always the loudest one. For several moments, nobody moved. The boardroom that had once been filled with assumptions now felt entirely different. The same executives who had overlooked Claire for years were seeing her clearly for the first time. Not as a secretary, not as an assistant, not as someone standing quietly in the background. They were finally seeing the person she had always been. Ethan Crawford slowly stood from his chair. The room watched him. Earlier that day, his words had drawn laughter. His confidence had dominated every conversation. Now he seemed far less certain. He looked toward Claire and took a breath. "I owe you an apology." The room remained silent. Ethan continued, "I judged you based on a title. I assumed I understood your value without ever taking the time to understand who you were." Claire listened without interrupting. There was no anger in her expression, no satisfaction either. Just the same calm presence she had carried all day. Ethan lowered his eyes briefly. "You saved this company today, and I spent the morning treating you as though your opinion did not matter." Nobody spoke. The honesty of the moment seemed to affect everyone in the room. Claire smiled gently. "We all make assumptions sometimes." Her answer surprised several executives. There was no bitterness, no attempt to embarrass him. She simply accepted the apology and moved forward. Margaret Holloway watched quietly from across the table. She knew something many people spend years learning. True confidence rarely announces itself. It does not need to. One of the engineers stepped forward. "Why did you never tell anyone?" Claire looked around the room. The question seemed genuine. She thought about it for a moment before answering. "Because I did not need to." The room grew still again. Claire glanced toward the city skyline beyond the windows. "For a long time, my career was my entire identity. Every conversation was about achievements, recognition, and success. Eventually, I realized there were other things in life worth valuing." Several people nodded. Others simply listened. "When I came here, I wanted something simpler. I wanted peace. I wanted meaningful work. I did not need people to know my history." The words settled over the room. Suddenly, many of them understood. Claire had never hidden because she lacked confidence. She had stepped away because she no longer needed validation. That realization seemed even more impressive than her accomplishments. As employees slowly began leaving the boardroom, the atmosphere felt lighter. The crisis was over. Operations were stable. The company had survived. Yet the most important thing that happened that day had nothing to do with technology. It had nothing to do with systems or logistics or corporate strategy. It was a lesson about people. Before leaving, Claire picked up her planner and headed toward the door. Several executives thanked her as she passed. Others offered respectful smiles. Ethan watched quietly. Then Claire stopped and looked back one final time. "Titles tell you what someone does," she said softly. "They do not tell you what someone knows." A hush fell across the room. Nobody had a response because none was needed. And as the afternoon sunlight filled the boardroom, everyone present carried away the same lesson. The smartest person in the room is often the one nobody notices. And that day, an entire company remembered what dignity looks like.